Happy New Year and most welcome to Heidegger 1337. And here the work continues on the new year. We're back at the University Library. Today I will continue with the text of Dr. Paul M. Livingston. Heidegger reads Wittgenstein, Wittgenstein reads Heidegger. And we were at the quote Heidegger made about Wittgenstein late in his career, referring to Tractatus, and he calls it the view of everything in the world is, all language is correspondent to something that is called fact. And this Heidegger called Gespentischer. It is almost like crazy or scary. And this is same. It could be called repetition, superficial. And it's one only thing. It is for all sake, from the Gespentisches viewpoint, this is always the same. But in the why question, the broader Heideggerian approach, the same thing can be different. We've been mentioning this before in the Necke cube and the Klein bottle. In this case, we have both shallow and deep. It is abstract and surface. It is inclusive. But the Gespentischer is superficial in the way it is only deep or only shallow. It takes, so to speak, only one singular level. And important here, on a written text nothing changes, well, nothing significant. But it's a whole world of difference. According to Wittgenstein and Heidegger, this is the biggest difference there could be. Although, for all of us, in the Gespentischer viewpoint, it all looks the same, or at least very, very similar. When I studied philosophy many years ago, I felt it was a slight difference, and so did the professor, and so did a lot of the interlocutors and interpreters of both Wittgenstein. I think von Wright is a good example, the renowned Finnish philosopher of class. But he did felt that there was only a slight difference. The difference is enormous, and this was helped by Livingston, but of course standing on the massive amount of lectures that have been going on before. I will cut to the chase and go into the lecture. Continue the text at page 21. There will be a link in the description that will take you to the text so you can follow it further. It is the second paragraph of page 21. And we return to the seminar session of September the 2nd in 1969. And Heidegger has been pondering about the problem with his seminal book, Being and Time, and that it, so to speak, it hadn't done the trick. It presented the idea, but it was, so to speak, in front of the eyes, directly perceivable. I would say also within grasp. Because this is very, with the Gespentische viewpoint, everything needs to be in front of the eyes. It needs to be possible to directly grasp it. And when I say grasp, I mean that in abstract and literal sense, we need to understand it directly in the Gespentische. There's no time delay. We reach out for it. You could think about instinct, animal-like. It's a little bit like my home country, Sweden, where there is a sign for everything. And there are also signs that tell you to look at the sign. This is Gespentische. It is all in the open. It is all under the sun. It's all lighted up, like the Enlightenment. There is no place here for aletheia and theia. There's no place here for explicit and implicit. Everything is put into the open. Clear, determined, defined, finished. Monosemic maybe. Whereas here, there is almost always darkness somewhere. It is covering up. Understanding is constantly mixed with non-understanding. There's even a viewpoint that complete understanding is a problem. This is why Heidegger called it Gespentische, which is a rather strong term. Gespentische means
spooky,
eerie, spooky, weird, unnatural. But that is the viewpoint from Heidegger. And it's even better in this text because it's also a misquote. That in itself is a very big clue, which Paul Livingston is using to the utmost efficiency. I go into the text. In closing the seminar session of September the 2nd, 1969, Heidegger again looks back at the problematic of being and time. In that book, Heidegger says the question of being is already posed primarily not as the question, what is being? But rather as what is this is. The question thus posed immediately runs into the difficulty that if the is, then it is a being. Whereas if it is not, then it appears to be bare and empty. Even perhaps to be nothing more than the empty copula of a judgment. It was in order to come out of this aporia Heidegger suggests that being and time posed the question of the is from the perspective of the sense of being, understanding sense, specifically as a project of understanding. My comment here is this is similar to grasping, to put into the open. Clarify. But this way of formulating the question was, Heidegger now says, very important, inappropriate. In that it made it all too possible to understand the project in a human performance and as a structure of subjectivity. This is indeed specifically Heidegger suggests how Sartre understands it in his own philosophy. Which bases itself in this respect upon Descartes. Nevertheless, beyond or before the assumption of such a constitutive subject of sense, it is possible, Heidegger suggests, to take up the problem of the is. Rather as a problem of truth. Here understood as the pre or non-subjective structural basis for opening and grounding disclosure of being. Quote, in order to counter this mistaken conception and to retain the meaning of project as it is to be taken. The thinking after being and time replaced the expression meaning of being with truth of being. And in order to avoid any falsification of the sense of truth, in order to exclude its being understood as correctness. Truth of being was explained by location of being. Truth as locality of being. The concepts are Ortschaft and Örtlichkeit. This already presupposes, however, an understanding of the place being of place. Hence the expression topology of being. End of quote. Remember here how Heisenberg's uncertainty theorem is exactly the same thing. It has to do with placing locality. The problematic of topology of being, to which Heidegger here gestures, is than nothing other than the consideration of the structure through which being grants the sense and truth of beings. Or, in other terms, how it grants the possibility of a world. So the part I'm going into now is the third. I have suggested that the missed encounter between Wittgenstein and Heidegger conceals foundational problems about logic, sense, meaning, and the totality of the world that are still substantially unsolved today. One of these is the ancient problem of the nature and force of the logos. Which subsumes both the more local 20th century philosophical inquiry into language and the methods of formal and symbolic logic that have simultaneously defined many 20th century approaches. Here, as we have seen, there's a co-implied, a broad problem of force. What is the basis and status of the force of logical rules and laws, or their actual effectiveness in relation to the activities, techniques, and practices that increasingly characterize life on the planet today. Another closely related problem as we have repeatedly seen, is the problem of the totality. The problem of our relation to the totality of the world, or the being of all that is. Or to whatever sets its limits or determines its extent. Without diminishing the difficulty of the issues involved in the formulation, both of these problems might also be put, it seems, as problems of finitude. That is, as problems about how a properly finite being has whatever problematic relationship it can have. Whether in thought or in action. To what we might understand as the infinite dimension of sense. Up to and including the sense of the world. Seen in this way, the problematic of the logic and sense of the world is, to begin with, a problem of limit. How is it being in the world? Nevertheless capable of grasping something of the world as a whole in which it exists. If it is capable of doing so at all. That both Heidegger and Wittgenstein see the question of the totality of the world as one that is linked to the question of the expressive or descriptive powers of language suggests. As we have seen, that it is to be addressed only by means of a renewed reflection on language's forms. and on the historical and contemporary structures in which they allow themselves to be thought or presented. But that both also mark the problem as one in which language positively confronts its own limits. In the necessary inexpressibility of whatever lies beyond the world, suggests that we may draw from both philosophers the indication of a necessary complication inherent to the problematic of sense. In the topology or limitology that is thereby invoked, in particular, that being itself is not a being. And that whereof we cannot speak, there we must be silent. Might then be the problematic claims through which if it follows the suggestions made by both Heidegger and Wittgenstein, a future inquiry might pursue the question of the ultimate dispensation of sense as we meet with it in the forms of our lives. But is there a world for us today if, as I have suggested, both Wittgenstein and Heidegger point to the question of the force of logos? And logic in relation to the totality of the world. Then the single question that it is formulated by both may be put as the question of realism about the world as such a totality. This question bears close connections to the broader questions of realism and anti-realism that many contemporary and recent analytic and continental figures have discussed from different perspectives. And using various definitions of the terms. But because its topic is the world as a whole, it is distinct from the question of realism about any kind of entity or entities in any of their aspects. Even as they are in themselves or in general. it is also not primarily to be posed as the question of how or whether specific entities are conditioned by our epistemic access to them. Or, as we have seen, as that of the dependence of being or truth on our specifically human constitution or capacities, unless this just means the capacities that can be possessed by a being that can speak and understand language, and hence grasp sense at all. In particular, if the 20th century linguistic turn, in both its analytic and continental variants, already witnesses a decisive turn away from the idea of epistemology as first philosophy, and toward a variety of practices of philosophical analysis. And reflection grounded in the consideration of linguistic structure and sense. Then it is plausibly no longer adequate in its wake to pose the question of realism about the world as one of the limits of our knowledge or epistemic access. Or about the conditions under which a subject can have knowledge of objects. Rather, the question here to be formulated is precisely about sense. And how the world is meaningfully given as an intelligible whole to understanding or reasoning. Or about whether the idea of such a whole as what provides the broadest and most possible condition for the sense of things is even so much as coherent. Posed in this way, the question asks in linguistic mode whether there is a thinkable totality of all that is also. In some logical sense, a unity, a one whose composition or structure is itself intelligible, on the basis of a formal consideration of it. In fact, this question was already central to discussion between recognizable ancestors of the analytic and continental traditions. long before the linguistic turn itself. The negative answer to it, given by Kant, in the argument of the antinomies section of the critique of pure reason. For instance, points to the broadly logical paradoxes that he took to be involved in any conception of the world as a completed totality of phenomena. While one of Hegel's main goals in the science of logic was to overcome this Kantian antinomic reasoning by means of a speculative picture of the ultimate reconciliation of the paradoxes of the whole at the level of the absolute. Whereas Husserl, in his later phenomenology, treated the world in one of its senses as the indeterminate but always expansible horizon of possible experience. His analysis of meaning and sense also pointed to what he saw as its basis in the or proto-rational foundation of the everyday life world. In the early decades of what would become the analytic tradition, the question already posed by Kant received a more rigorous kind of formulation through Cantor's set theory. And the paradoxes of totality, most decisively Russell's paradox of the set of all sets not members of themselves, as you might remember from a couple of lectures ago when we discussed Heidegger versus Russell's. Let me repeat. Most decisively, Russell's paradox of the set of all sets not members of themselves. That appeared to show the impossibility of maintaining without contradiction the existence of a total set or set of all sets. Today, differing answers to the question of the world also situate and articulate key contemporary projects of both analytic and continental philosophers. On the one hand, recent prominent projects in analytic metaphysics, such as David Chalmers' Constructing the World, and Ted Sider's Reading the Book of the World. Have essentially presupposed or relied upon the coherence of the idea of the world in their strongly constructivist or naturalist projects of analyzing its structure. On the other, recent positions of a more directly continental lineage. Set out by contrast from a radical denial of the existence of a totality of all that is. For example, early in his 1988 Being and Event, Alain Badiou declares as a fundamental motivating basis for his project of set theoretical ontology that the one is not or more specifically, that there is no total domain of entities, objects, facts, or phenomena. This claim of radical non-totality is in one sense an axiomatic decision. But Badiou also seeks to motivate it on the level of ontological reflection by considering the implications of Russell's paradox of the set of all sets that are not elements of themselves. Here, therefore, the world is understood as radically incomplete, or as fundamentally incapable of being gathered into a single totality, on pain of irreducible contradiction or paradox. And now it's getting even more interesting. From this perspective, the requirement to maintain the consistency of the language in which beings and phenomena are presented itself requires the non-existence of the world as such. And in the singular, this position extended, but not fundamentally modified, in Badiou's 2006 sequel, Logics of Worlds, which posits an irreducibly plurality of worlds as individually structured domains of presentation. Each with its own logic, but another possibility. Very much within the matrix of the same problems, but suggesting a radically different answer to them. Is the one explored by Graham Priest in a series of works to explore the structure of the paradoxes that arise necessarily on the assumption of the existence of the totality of all that can be thought. Or all that is linguistically expressible, or the one of all that is, accommodating them with a para-consistent logic, that is, one that does not assume the principle of ex falso quod libet, according to which anything at all can be inferred from a contradiction, and maintaining the existence of actually true contradictions. This is just marvelous. The suggestion by Alain Badiou is exactly the one of Gespentische. And here down we have our old friend Graham Priest, the Australian logician, mathematician, philosopher of renowned recognition, and it also mirrors what happens in physics, and where we have opposing camps as well. As Alain Badiou said, all life worlds exist with consistent logics, and they exist simultaneously. This is the language/philosophical direct equivalent of many worlds. And this is where paradoxes are not only assumed, but necessary. It's not hard to see how the different Neckercube takes on the fact on the one singular expression in this example leads to two different moods. In this case, the mood of Alain Badiou, the mood is unchangeable, whatever it is. And here, change of mood is a necessity, not always the same mood. Very neatly, and some questions, of course.
So, Alain Badiou, if I could paraphrase the idea, so you could say, for instance, a hat. A hat is both a hat that belongs to the category of hats, but is still not a hat. It also belongs to another category, say clothing or whatever. Is that what you mean, or Badiou means that?
Yes, everything is restricted here. Everything is put into the clear open. It is defined. And as I said early in the lecture, it is understandable because it's clear. It is repeatable. It is in some way the same. And this was also the complaint of Martin Heidegger in the 1969 lecture, that being and time had become put into the open to be understood. And this is, of course, the direction he wanted to take and try to sort of have to push everything. Priest, as we mentioned many times before, and I also start thinking it's time to contacting him. He seems to be a fellow of very, very good demeanor, is showing us the way out of the Gespentischer viewpoint.
Yes, you helped to deepen the concept of Schrödinger's cat also, for instance. It's so easy to put it only the category of dead cat or the category of living cats, while the cat can also be sleeping. So it's and we have seen from Penrose that you have different types of consciousness. So it's you cannot put any. We have many categories. So that's good, Alain Badiou and Chris, of course. Yes, absolutely.
Put a little pause there, let's maybe stretch. Apart from me putting a link directly to the article, it can be found in this book, Beyond the Analytic Continental Divide, a Pluralist Philosophy in the 21st Century. This is how it looks.
Editors Bell, Goodrow Fellow, and Livingston himself.
Livingston
So three
himself
editors.
is also. And it's a collection of different authors. Thank you very much, Kalle, for the handout. And I have to mention I'm excited that Graham Priest turns up and we get this very nice parallel to what we discussed with many worlds, Hugh Everett, Max Tegmark. And once you are in the fixed mode, so to speak, there is no other way than to go either to have already existing fixed logical words or logical spaces, or as Tegmark Everett would have it, fixed physical, non-perceivable, other transcendental worlds. Very nice parallel. I continue here, presently at page 26. From this perspective, the requirement to maintain the consistency of the language in which beings and phenomena are presented itself requires the non-existence of the world as such, and in the singular this position is extended but not fundamentally modified in Badiou's 2006 sequel, Logics of Worlds. I think that is a grand parallel. I continue. If then these various contemporary projects are united in giving a presuppositional or foundational status, is thus one or another assumption about the way in which formal and logical reasoning captures or indicates the limits of. A consideration of the world as a whole. It appears possible to pose the question that divides them, that of the way in which formalism at its limits itself articulates the logical or metalogical structure of the world as such. This is not, importantly, a question about the powers or limits of specific natural historical languages. Such as they might be thought to show up in the problems of mutual translation or in the question of the incommensurability of various languages with one another. It is rather essential to its posing, and as I have argued, urgent in receiving the legacy of Wittgenstein and Heidegger. To understand it as a question about the structure and limits of language in the singular, or of language as such. It is true that 20th century and contemporary inheritors of the linguistic turn, even and perhaps even especially in the light of interpretations of Wittgenstein or Heidegger, or both, have often denied the existence of any such thing. Declaring rather the morale of an irreducible contingency or an irredeemable plurality. On this kind of position, there are indeed words in the plural, correspondent to the variety of cultures, languages, or practices. But there is no one word correlative to language as such. As the totality of all that is, or all that can be said or meant. And to the last to be said or meant, there is a incredibly interesting note here. I take the liberty to read 61. The conclusion that Richard Rorty draws from a consideration of the positions and development of the early and late Wittgenstein, as well as the early and late Heidegger in his 1989 article, Wittgenstein, Heidegger, and the reification of language. In the article, Rorty opposes the tendency to reify or hypostasize language to his own pragmatist inclinations. Which involve emphasizing instead the contingency of all languages. And their thorough embedding in historically situated practices. And my commentaries think of Geschichte or etymology. This opposition produces a reading according to which Wittgenstein and Heidegger passed each other in mid-career, going in opposite directions. The former advancing in the direction of pragmatism, and the rejection of the very idea of philosophy as positive theory. While the latter regressed from the social pragmatism formulated according to Rorty in Being and Time, to the later mysticism marked by the ground being historical narrative of the totality and closure of Western metaphysics. A narrative of which Rorty himself is suspicious. Both Rorty's characterization of the developments of the two philosophers and his critique of the tendency to reify language are. However, consequences of his own presumptive dismissal of the problematic of language and world that we have considered here. According to Routledge, for example, it is essential in avoiding the reification that he inveighs against, that we not think either of language in general or a particular language. As something which has edges, something which forms a bounded whole and can thus become a distinct object of study or of philosophical theorizing. Insofar as Routledge cites here a basis for this dismissal, it is the morale he draws from Donald Davidson's project of semantic analysis and its naturalized approach. However, it is certainly possible to read the implications of Davidson's project differently. As suggesting both the positive possibility of a transcendental or quasi-transcendental analysis of the positive conditions of linguistic truth and meaning, that itself develops the problematic of the structure of language and world considered here. End of this rather long referential point. I will just have to say I read that book by Richard Routledge, and admittedly I fell for the trap then. And I now realize it's the problem is deeper, although it is expressible in exactly the same way. So the formal, explicit, definitive expression can be the very same, but it has a whole variety of expressible but formally non-expressible understanding. This footnote should have been in the text, I think. and I almost missed it. This is very good, very good. Kalle, yes. Oh, yeah, sure.
It's interesting with Richard Rorty. So if I understood him correctly, so Rorty says that, for instance, he wants to avoid edges. He says that let us say that you want to become English specialist. You study English at the university. However, what is really English? Every language has loan words. You cannot say here ends English and here begins German. I think that is Rorty's point, and we agree with him. I think because we spoke earlier that we shouldn't put things in. It's not possible to put things in categories like hat is. It belongs to several categories. Or did I understand correctly?
Yeah, that's right.
But what was the trap that you fell in? You mean?
Oh, it is.
Did you agree with Rorty?
Yes, I did indeed, and Rorty is right, but the problem is more than a problem only. It is to do with this. By wanting to broaden what language is and seeing them to be limitless, you fall into the other trap, making limitless a fact, making that a definition. So that was, well, trap is a hard word, but I did like it and it opened up, but I also realized by saying limitless and having no borders is it in itself also a determination of kind. And what led me astray is what Rorty wrote in his book, that the later Heidegger then strided into mysticism, and the later Wittgenstein went further into the field of pragmatism. And of course, it is a very pragmatic viewpoint to say language, logic, world do not have borders. And it's very tough to see once he ended in that conclusion, it would also be a rejection, so to speak, or at least criticism of the later Heidegger.
Now I think I get the trap, so to say. The danger that Rorty is like that you have in general linguistics, is that you, as you said, that you don't have any limits. So every language is the same. Like German is the same as English. That's the trap, I think, as you said, is the same.
Yes,
Yeah, I get it now. Yes, absolutely. Okay, yes.
We have to understand to say limitless, and also, as I show here, it can build a trap as well. Polysemic can be understood as a definition of what the word is, and that the word is polysemic. And of course, Livingston do not agree with Rorty. He says there is a parallel between Heidegger and Wittgenstein. They are developing both and getting deeper. And I would say they broaden the understanding. And I think Heidegger himself was keenly aware, and this is why it's so good that Livingston, so to speak, inferred that specific quote where he ponders about being and time.
Check it. 1 hour 45.
41.
Kaffe. Okej, arbeta. Så att vi...
The index and proof of this radical non-existence of the world in the singular is often here the presumptive incommensurability of languages and cultures. The salutary differences that allow for the inscription in every communication and practical relationship, the ineffable reserve of the untranslatable, or the irreducibility of the individual, situated or radically embodied. But if, as I have argued, the dynamics of the contemporary global regime of capital, technology, and information force us to consider in a renewed way the possibility of a critical reflection on the unity of the world. And then it is relevant to consider the ways that both Heidegger and Wittgenstein through their considerations of language, meaning and sense, themselves undertake this reflection and point toward its further development. What form might such a further development of the problematic of the relationship of the structure of language to the possibility of the world take today? On the one hand, it would involve a renewed inquiry into the possible sense of the one of what is as it gives itself to be thought. This would be a contemporary repetition of the problem posed by Parmenides about the logical sense of being. To whose response Plato devoted the considerable resources of his late argumentation in dialogues such as the Parmenides, the Sophist, and the Philebus. On the other hand, and just as importantly, it would involve displacing this inquiry onto the transformed ground of contemporary logic and formal knowledge. To pursue the inquiry would then be, in the Heideggerian jargon, to grasp the very basis of linguistic sense as resisting. Not in factual institutions or given situations, but in the underlying or deeper structure of granting of presence. The opening of the possibility of sense, or the meaning of a life on the ultimate ground of what is. Or it would be to take up in a renewed way the inquiry into the essential and unitary dimension of form that arguably articulates beyond or before empirical instances. The key concepts of both Wittgenstein's those of logical form and forms of life, and given both philosophers' arguments, this would be something like the problem of the origin of sense in the abeyance of any source of sense in any subject, object, entity, fact, or situation. Because it's not possible to determine the sense of the world without contradiction from a position within it. And there is at the same time no position outside the world from which to determine it either. This inquiry would have to take up in a deepened way the critical question of what sets or establishes the limit of the world. And its description, and how this setting itself complicates the easy topological distinction between a simple inside and a simple outside. Do remember the Klein bottle here, or the Möbius strip. the consideration of how possibilities and structures of sense arise at or in the problematization of boundaries of whatever is, and do so quite independently of any kind of human intentionality, activity, capacity, or purpose, might then also define a fitting topic for critical reflection within a philosophical praxis to come. Thus distinguished from the characteristic 20th century pathos of the human agentive subject of meaning, and the constitutive anxiety of its nullification. I had to put a comment here. He has obviously read Rodolphe Cachet. End of comment. Within a senselessly plural being, one task of 21st century philosophy might then be to locate forms and structures of sense in their original givenness at the problematic limit of the world itself. And thereby I conclude the article of Livingston that dealt with limits. We have discussed this in different ways, in different aspects, and for every new aspect we add a modus from the Necke cube, and we can get more views. Whereas if we do as Richard Rorty, just read Wittgenstein and Heidegger, I think it's almost inevitable that you get sort of fixed here in the Gespantischer. This is exactly what Heidegger raised his finger for and was wary about in the lecture in September of 1969. Adding more viewpoints, taking in contradictory to a certain extent readings outside of Heidegger and Wittgenstein, as we have been doing all the way from physics, logic, mathematics, neurology, cognitive sciences, and so forth, make for a possibility of understanding Heidegger and avoiding what I call trap, a little bit exaggerated, of Richard Rorty. Limitlessness is fine, but it can itself become a limit, which is clearly proven by Alain Badiou. There is very little time left here. Maybe a finishing question from Kalle? Or,
Yes. Thank you, Hans, for presenting this paper by Paul Livingston, this 2016 paper. The paper began with a quotation by it quoted Augustine, who said that, "What you scoundrel, you would speak no nonsense. Go ahead and speak nonsense, it doesn't matter." And that was
it was regarded the definition of the good, and we see a lot of definitions in Plato, for instance. But this shows already Augustine that language has its limits. And let's say that you want to define the good. Again, then you say the good is this, you put signs, this is, and then what the new problem, what is it not there, would you put the limit? That is the weakness of these definitions. Of course, you need definitions perhaps in a dictionary, but it's very limiting.
Yes, indeed. We need borders, because without borders and limits we cannot have limitlessness. Without fire we cannot have water. Without coolness we cannot have warmness. And they do not define each other. They are together. And it can be helpful sometime. Wittgenstein is using this helpful tool. Looking at contradictions that are different. Winter and summer are contradictions, but they are not at all absolute contradictions. So it is showing to the real world, and all that these people have, everything they have, it will be included here, and much, much more. So nothing is really negated. And I read Richard Routledge, I can still have use of that. It does not disappear. And this is a very similar point as Tony Shimiro pointed out, that if we go too hard into thesis, antithesis and synthesis, we lose out. The way of that superficial contradiction, you can call it, because there is a deeper contradiction that Heidegger and Wittgenstein is pointing to, that the superficial one had a tendency to obscure, or, as we put it here, to put it too much into the light. And what happens if you put something directly under the sun, the July sun? It dissipates, it disappears, it burns itself out. I think we have to finish here before.
Okay, thank you again.
Thank you.